All right, and we're live. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the special .NET episode of the Azure Functions Live webcast. I'm Anthony, and I'm joined by Fabio. Fabio, you want to say hi?
Hey.
Okay, that was fast.
About as far as I'm going to go right now. Yeah.
All right. So a few weeks ago, we announced the production readiness of the new .NET Isolated Worker. So we're going to talk about that today. I'm going to answer your questions if you have them. So feel free to leave them in chat. I'll try to grab those, and we'll make Fabio answer them. And so we're just going to go right into it, I think. And we're working on this new fancy system here. We haven't figured out how this works yet. There we go. Okay. So where are we now? So we have .NET running in process pretty much since the beginning. And we're still going to continue having that. So for .NET 6 LTS, we actually plan to have a preview ready, hopefully in the summer, that we can all use to deploy our .NET 6 preview apps to Azure. So this will be the first time that we offer a preview for really any language, I think. And then for day one of .NET 6 LTS, we are going to, you're going to be able to deploy Azure Functions apps in production. So, and then what we announced a few weeks ago was a new way of building .NET 5 application or .NET applications. We're calling it the isolated process model, and that allows us to now decouple the .NET the .NET functions that you're writing from the functions runtime itself. So that brings a lot of benefits. So one thing is we don't have to worry about updating the functions runtime every time that we have to support a new version of .NET. So that allows us to kind of rev and keep up with .NET a lot better than we've been so far. And I think it also kind of brings a lot of benefits as well, being separate from the main process. We've had a bunch of issues in the past about dependencies that might conflict with things that are running in the host. That should all be resolved now.
Yeah, that's primarily because of the coupling that exists today. I think that the biggest issue is really the .NET version that we are running in the runtime. As you said, it does bring a bunch of additional benefits and addresses a lot of long-standing asks, including the ability to go down and completely control what we call on main. So you have full control of the process. It's your process. You bring your own set of dependencies. You configure that process however you want to run. And we are kind of flipping things a little bit, where before with the traditional isolated traditional in-proc model, we are loading your code and we are acting as the host, and we are actually dynamically loading all of your functions, your dependencies. Everything runs within the host process. There is an isolation boundary there, but we are essentially hosting all of your code. With this model, with the isolated process, you're referencing a set of NuGet packages. You are bringing the worker capabilities as a dependency of your application, but you are in full control over that application, over that process, and what that dependency graph looks like.
Yeah, and as those of you who've tried it out so far have probably noticed that there are some things missing that you might be used to in the in-process model. Those will be coming over time. One of the big ones is durable functions. Durable functions is actually like a pretty big extension that's running inside of the host, and for all the out-of-process languages that needs to support it, there's a substantial amount of work that needs to be done to kind of work with the extension in the host, so that the orchestrations can actually work properly. So we'll be starting work on that pretty soon, and so hopefully we'll be able to bring that maybe later this year or sometime next year. And then our plan is that the isolated process model will eventually be the model that that the .NET functions will be running in. So that's that completely decouples .NET functions from the runtime itself, like we were talking about before. So bringing lots of benefits. And the migration model that we kind of think that most people, or I guess the migration path that I think most people will be taking, unless you really need .NET 5 support right now, we're expecting a lot of customers to stay on the in-process model, and we're seeing a lot of that right now. And we'll get full .NET 6 support, and that's going to have the entire feature set that everyone's used to right now. And then as we kind of continue to evolve the out-of-process isolated process model, folks will be able to migrate over there if they need support for .NET 7. We also plan on having day one support for .NET 7, .NET 8, and beyond. But for folks who need to stay on LTS, and a lot of our big enterprise customers do need to do that, they'll probably be migrating over to the isolated process model in time for .NET 8. So by then, we expect the out-of-process isolated process model to be very mature by then, and people should be able to migrate over and be pretty successful with it. All right, so I think now it's time for a demo. I don't see too many questions. Actually, there might be one question right now about durable functions. Is there any possibility to have a durable function in process call an activity function that's in an isolated process?
If I understand correctly, mixing the in-proc and out-of-proc model for durable, right? Nothing that I would recommend at this point. Nothing that I would say is a path that we should recommend anyone exploring. You can look at the feedback that we're getting on the chat. We hear that feedback on Twitter, and we feel that as well. Like durable is a key feature of functions for us, and we've been working very closely with the durable team to see how quickly we can get that implemented and up and running with .NET out-of-proc. So yeah, unfortunately, like the only thing I would recommend at this point is that if you really need durable, stick with the in-proc model. If you need to move to auto-proc, it's going to be a matter of time, but yeah, we are working to get that done and implemented as soon as possible.
And we have some questions about rich bindings, which I think we'll probably cover a little bit later.
Yeah.
There's actually one about, are there any other languages that follow the isolated process model?
That's a good question. So this is not a brand new territory for functions, right? So .NET, it was actually always the odd language. When it comes to functions, it was the only language that had a different execution model. The out-of-proc surface that we are using with the .NET worker and the isolated model is the same model that all of the other languages that we support in functions they use today. So we are now essentially aligning with all of the other languages, which will help .NET adopt some interesting features, but it will also help us advance the host and what we can do for other languages. I know this is primarily a .NET crowd, given the topic, but if you work with other languages, you can expect to see some benefits from us now consolidating all of the languages under the same model. So yeah, that the model has been in place for a while now. Awesome.
And we also have a question about F5 debugging support in Visual Studio.
That is so close. We at this point is in alignment on releases. The Visual Studio team working with the functions extensions. They are working hard on this. We've been working very closely with the broader team to bring this capability. Hopefully, I'll have a demo today that will show you how close this is and how you can actually get by in the meantime until the full tooling support is in place.
Great. So should we move over to your demo?
Sure, let's do that. share my screen. Make this big enough so everyone can see. And I really want to start this from scratch, like really the basic, which is how do I get started? How do I create one of those functions? How do I use the new process, the new model? There are a couple of different ways. We have different tools that you can use to get started with functions, and we are adding support to every single one of those. As we just discussed, Visual Studio, that support is being worked on, and it's coming very soon. But we already have support in place in Core Tools and Visual Studio Code. So we wanted to show the experience with code, what that looks like, and how we can create one of those functions and run that. So the same flow as we've used in the past. When you have the extension installed, the Azure Functions extensions in VS Code, you're going to have an option to create a new function project. And I apologize, my machine is not happy with the screen sharing, so it's running a little slow.
And do you mind zooming in a bit more?
Absolutely. Let me do that. Is that better?
Yep, I think so. Thanks.
Yeah, if I need to adjust, please let me know. So what you see here is that as we go down the path of selecting the language, when it's a .NET language, I'm now presented with two different options. .NET Core 3, which is the LTS version, and the .NET 5 isolated. So let's pick .NET 5. Same experience as we've had in the past. You can select one of the triggers. Let's create an HTTP function. Let's rename this. Let's set it to anonymous. So VS Code is now creating that project, and we'll get everything that I need in order to run this locally and actually debug in Visual Studio Code. So if you're missing some of the debugging experience in VS, and you're familiar with VS Code, if you have the option to use VS Code, you might consider doing that now. But it's something that will give you the local debugging experience, the F5 debugging experience. Before we actually run these, I want to very briefly walk through the code. What you will see here is that what we have in place is very much, it looks very much like a traditional .NET console app. We tried very hard to make sure that the functions that feels like anything else that you want to bring in. If you're working with a ASP.NET Core, Worker Services, just a traditional console app using the generic host model, you will be familiar with the set of APIs we're currently exposing. Let me go back here. And essentially, we are exposing extensions on top of the generic builder that enable you to register the functions worker and bring that onto your application. So along the lines of what we described earlier, where you are essentially bringing a set of dependencies, and we can show the project here. We have a few packages that have been added to our project. There is our SDK, the worker, which brings out the set of APIs that we're using here to interact with the new worker model. And one thing that is important, we'll touch on this topic a little bit, is the set of extensions that have been exposed. So you've worked with bindings in the past using attributes with the .NET improc model. We have essentially a new set of bindings that mirror what we've had in the past and bring the appropriate API surface to work with the autoproc model, just to make sure that we're not bringing a lot of things that are not supported or not applicable in the autoproc model. So that gives us a little bit of flexibility and gives extension authors a lot of flexibility on how they want to expose the APIs when running in proc, what set of services they want to bring in, what they want to register. So that gives us that ability. So you will see that anytime we are referencing and working with a different set of extensions, there is a different set of packages under now Microsoft.Azure Functions Worker extensions namespace, base package ID, and you essentially see like a direct mirror from the old WebJobs extension packages to the new workers. One thing that is kind of implied by what I just said is that you're not working with WebJobs APIs anymore in this new model. We don't bring a WebJobs dependency as part of this. WebJobs is not part of the process that you're going to be running, which eliminates a lot of dependencies and eliminates some issues that we've had to deal with in the past. But that's also something that having a different set of packages for the autoproc model helps us achieve. We'll dive a little deeper into some of the APIs, but this is the boilerplate code that you would need in order to configure the worker to get it all set up. We expose some methods that will essentially configure all the defaults for you to make that configuration simple. Once the host builder is configured with all of the services that we will need, you can essentially just build and run that host, and that will get a worker set up, a worker that knows how to communicate with a host, how to dispatch to your functions, all set up within your process. If you look at the function, and Anthony, I'm not looking at the questions too much, so if there isn't anything that pops up, feel free to stop me at any point here. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them as we go. But this is what an HTTP functions, HTTP function would look like. So you will see here that it's very similar to the model that we've had before. We've simplified some of the attributes. One key thing when it comes to HTTP specifically is that we don't yet have support for the traditional ASP.NET Core types. This falls into some of the rich binding support that we've talked about as we announced the general availability of the worker. But we are using the same model that is currently exposed to all of the autoproc workers. We get essentially a representation of the HTTP request, the HTTP response, and that's what we are exposing here. We wanted to make sure this was very clear to developers because of some key limitations that are in place when working with some of these abstractions. The option was not to expose not to work on top of some of the ASP.NET Core abstractions, but have an appropriate set of abstractions that correctly represent what we are working with. And our goal is to actually introduce an HTTP extension based on ASP.NET Core, giving you the same set of abstractions, same set of types that you've been using, with full access to the HTTP request pipeline, and that essentially what you have access to today with an improc model and with a traditional ASP.NET Core application. Including the ability, which is something that a lot of the other languages have been asking for a while, but the ability to support streamed responses and more advanced HTTP features from the autoproc worker. I want to pause here because I think we've covered quite a bit of ground. Before we move forward, I want to make sure that we don't have any questions that we want to address. In the meantime, I will hit F5 here so you can all see what that experience looks like. This will, my machine is, I can hear the fan spinning, so this may take a bit, so it's a good time for questions.
All right, sounds good. Let's pull some questions. So we have a question about, is the program.cs class similar to the function startup class that we currently have to configure services?
In some ways, it is. It's the hook is the place where you would inject all of your services. It's a bit more powerful than that because it's actually setting up, that's your process entry point, right? So that's main. That's the just like a console app, you have the ability to do anything you wish within the that method to set up how the process is going to be configured and running. You can bring additional services. You're not limited to the worker. So this gives you access. It gives you essentially the same set of hooks that you had in the past with the function startup, which is the ability to register services. But you can run additional logic there as well. But you can think of that as what you have the ability to do with function startup is a subset of what you can do today with what I was just showing in Program CS.
Okay, makes sense. I think there's some questions related to sort of like now that .NET is running out of process, like, for instance, this question's about which App Insights SDKs should they be using? And then Josh had a follow-up question about just in general, like, do we lose any kind of visibility with in process versus out of process to basically the things that we're currently used to within process.
For App Insights specifically?
App Insights and just really like, just having the out of process model now. Things that we're used to before, like for instance, when I would imagine things like configuring services, they would interact with things maybe negatively with the host in the past. And now that configuring services and DI and all that stuff are totally separate.
Yeah, we've had some restrictions in the past because of how the host environment was set up for you. Things like application insights would come pre-configured, and there was some guidance that we had to provide on how to actually consume some of the services, and to make sure that you're not changing the configuration that the host was doing before you were loading your function. Some of those restrictions they are lifted with this model, right? That actually, when it comes to dependencies like application insights, like the ability to do things like registering a hosted service, some of those limitations have been lifted, have been removed with this model. So you have full control and flexibility over the services that you want to bring in. Application insights, the core configuration for the host still very much operates the same way. The host will still be pushing logs for execution for function details into application insights. And a lot of the logs, we'll look at that experience in a minute when we look at another function implementation. But when you get an iLogger of T for your function, when you request a logger, the logger is automatically wired up to push all of the logs through the host's configuration of application insights. So if you the same configuration that the same guidance that we provided in the past of how to provide the application insights key, how to configure your filters in host.json, all of that still applies and still in place here. But you do have the ability to bring the full application insights SDK. I would encourage you, if you're curious about what the developments in that particular space in logging specifically, we're actually having a discussion about that on the repo. We have a few issues that we're tracking right now to more than anything provide guidance and have a set of documents that describe how that works, how you would handle some of the more advanced scenarios with application insights more specifically. I hope that helps answer the question, but if not, please feel free to post a follow-up.
Yeah, and there's also some questions, I guess probably related to logging. So the way that we access the logger now, so what can we still do? What can't we do compared to before?
Let me actually switch to VS so we can show that experience there as well. And we can show a quick example of that. So let me also
is there a way to make it
increase
giant?
My font. Yeah, this is better. Let me get this out of the way.
Yeah, maybe bump it up a little bit more still. Perfect.
Great. So there are a couple of ways you can do that with functions. So this is with the autoproc model. This is one of the examples. We have this function context that is provided to you as part of your function execution. So with that, you actually have the ability, we have a set of APIs here that will give you access to get a logger. You have the ability to pass the category name if you wish to pass an arbitrary name to that, or just get a logger based on a given type. So familiar APIs, this will give you an iLogger that is correctly wired up to push the logs to all of the, not only all of the sources that we have set up in the host, but anything that you set up as part of your application bootstrapping in Program CS, in the host build up, that those logging providers would get would be part of this pipeline as well. So you'll be able to push logs from the worker directly to those different sources. The other model is if we use, let me undo some of these. If we use an instance class as opposed to a static method, you can just essentially define a constructor here that will take an iLogger of T. In this case, you can say an iLogger of HTTP function, have the logger passed into your constructor, and you can essentially have access to the logger, and from any function that you have defined within that class, you have the ability to access the logger and use that internally. And that comes, again, fully wired up the same way an iLogger coming from the execution context would be. So those are the two primary ways to get a logger. These would be plumbed like any service that you have injected that takes a dependency on iLogger of T will get the same iLogger with the same configuration. So if this applies not only to function classes, but also to middleware or any other services that you have registered as part of the extension itself, as part of the worker itself. One thing that is worth mentioning is that in the past, if you've worked with Brett in the past, like he'll express some of the issues that he had to work on. Brett did a lot of the work on the logging, in the logging infrastructure in functions. In the past, we used to fulfill dependency to iLogger. That's no longer supported with this model. So this actually aligns us with the rest of the .NET ecosystem. In the past, we did support in proc, we do support an iLogger, but that's one key difference, like when actually requesting a logger to use from a function, one key difference between the two models. Back. Let me try to run this again. The debugger, we ran the process, everything ran, but my machine is taking long enough that the VS Code is giving up on attaching to the process here. So I can remote into my other box and we can take a look at what that experience looks like. But essentially, I'm just hitting F5 here. You see the debugger is now waiting for the process to start up, building. And let's see if we get the debugger to properly attach. I actually do have one little tip that I want to share here with the debugger configuration.
Yeah, the debugger attaching problem because of the slow machine when you're sharing the screen. I had the same problem last time in the webcast. So you're not alone.
I'm glad to hear it's not just my machine, but doesn't help the outcome too much. Okay, maybe we did launching in time this time. Hey, we're attached. So from here, we now have the worker running. We have the process up and running. It was able to detect the HTTP trigger that we have set up. Let's go ahead and hit that endpoint. Let me bring the browser tab over here. And we're just hitting that. So we're just hitting the breakpoint, and we're debugging through our code running in the autoproc worker in this setup. So we can inspect the request, we can inspect the response and debug as you would expect with the VS experience. So this is the VS Code experience. So as you can see, the from a tooling perspective, a tooling support, the VS Code experience is giving you the full end-to-end debugging with F5. It's something you can use right now.
Great. We have some questions around like cross-cutting concerns. Like there's a couple of questions about configuring things like authentication, if that's possible now or not.
I think there is a question here about the debugger that's pertinent to what we're talking about here, about the debugger timeout. And the answer is yes. The VS Code extension does give you a setting that gives you the ability to change that timeout. So I could, if I'm running into this frequently, because even if I'm not presenting, my machine is just running slow, I can change that timeout, and I'll get myself some additional time to have the process spin up and run. Before we get to the next question, one of the things that I wanted to bring up is that if you look at the default configuration that is given to us when we set up the function in VS Code, if we look at the task that gets set up for us, this is the task that essentially runs the function score tools and the set of arguments passed to that. One issue you may find with this task, and we will be working to update this template so that you don't have to take this manual step anymore. But as we mentioned, you own the entry point. So you may want to put a breakpoint at the very beginning of main and debug your bootstrapping code, like how you're registering your services, how you're setting up any additional dependencies here. Because of how the process is being launched and the debugger is currently being attached by VS Code today, this code may run before you have the ability to actually, before VS Code has the ability to attach to that code. So something that you can do if you run into that issue, this is a capability of core tools. So you can pass a .NET isolated debug flag, and this will ensure that your process is actually initialized in a paused state until a debugger is actually attached. So this will give you the ability to debug even your entry point, avoiding the race between the debugger attaching and the process actually executing the entry point code. Sorry, Anthony, I believe you had a question you wanted to address as well.
Yeah, mostly around like setting up middleware and kind of cross-cutting concerns. And I think there's a question about using Microsoft Identity.web.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand in the context for that. We can talk about the middleware, and if we need to dive into specifics, specific implementations, specific scenarios, we can do that as well, or we can continue the conversation in the repo if there are concrete scenarios that we want to address. But let's take a look at what middleware registration looks like. And we can expand on that and dive a little deeper into what we can do with middleware, what we can't do right now, and some of the things that we're working on to enrich some of that experience as well.
Cool, sounds good.
So let me switch to VS. I've actually shared a little bit of this code already with all of you, but let me make sure I have this. In the state that I left. So one of the things that I wanted to show, we may have to, let me delete this type. Are some of the more advanced things you may want to do. So we talked a little bit about the fact that we have a nice method that gives you all of the defaults for functions.
Do you mind making this bigger again? Oh, thanks.
Yeah, doing that now. And you see that by default, the template will give you just a default to this method. And you have everything you need to run. That's what we were looking at with the demo that we ran in VS Code. But if you look at this method, we actually have some overloads here that we can use. that will give us some hooks to enable us to customize and configure the worker a little bit. So we have a bunch of different overloads depending on what you want to do. You may want to use a different one here, but I wanted to show an example here where one of the overloads gives me and this functions worker application builder. The other gives me essentially a set of options, configuration options for the worker itself. This builder gives me the ability to interact with the worker-specific services. So if I'm looking at the builder APIs, some of the things that we expose now here are methods to enable you to control the order of registration of the middleware. Register custom middleware. We'll look at these in just a second here as well. And the function specific, the functions worker specific extension methods are likely to show up in the builder, and that's where you would expect external dependencies. If they want to extend this experience, they would also be building on top of this builder, on top of this interface, and providing some extension methods. So when you have a new reference, they have the ability to enhance this experience here. The other option here for plain configuration is the ability for me to essentially change the default behavior and change some of the configuration that we have in the worker. One of the things that we are doing now, like this will grow over time. The number of options is somewhat limited right now, but this will hopefully at least give you a glimpse into what that pattern, how this will continue to evolve over time. But one of the things that we've had customers ask for a while now is the ability to switch the serializer that's being used by the host by default. So when you take an HTTP request and you're binding to a POCO, or if you are handling a service bus message and you're binding to something, anytime we rely on serialization, JSON serialization more specifically, to hydrate the object that we're giving to your function. There's some challenges if you don't have the ability to customize the serializer that you're using here. So this option gives you access to that. So you have the ability to, when you're configuring the worker, say, hey, by the way, this is the serializer I want to use. By default, we use, and we specify that here as well. We use the JSON object serializer using the text.json support. You can change this to a different implementation and use JSON.NET, for instance. It's an option you have. You can just assign the serializer, and that's what's going to be used throughout the worker anytime serialization and deserialization is required when interacting with your code. So those are some of the patterns, some of the things that you can explore when looking at the worker defaults. Before I dive into some of the other APIs here, we can actually leave this code as is and make sure I can still compile this after fiddling with the code. I think we had a question that was posted ahead of time asking about the debugging experience in VS. And we had one at the beginning as well about the F5 experience. And though that is coming, I want to share what you can do in the meantime to make that process a little easier. So when I create the process, and I can show how you can do that today just using the command line tools. But one of the things you can do is change your project properties, and we can do that from the actual properties page. It becomes a little easier. To instead of launching your project, launch it executable, and you can just call func from here. And the application arguments will be essentially the same thing that we saw earlier when we were looking at the VS Code configuration. So what the experience this will give me right now until the full F5 and tooling experience is enabled in VS. Actually, I can actually F5 onto this process. Let me bring the console window here. And as I mentioned, like this process is now in a paused, halted state. The code in main has not executed yet. You'll see here that we emit some information telling you, hey, the worker is running. This is the process ID you can use. This is the step that is a little painful right now, but we are working to address that, to have the seamless debug experience. But hopefully is better than some of the steps that you've had to take in the past when working with the worker. Hopefully some of these tips help. So we have the process ID. We can attach the process, and I'm using the shortcut. But if we go to debug and look for attach to process, this is an option you have in Visual Studio. So Control-Alt-P. I can simply type my process ID. So this is what I had here, 33444. And I talked too much, the worker gave up on me. But you have a minute to attach to that. Right now, with timeout, we won't wait indefinitely, so you're not just hung on the process. You can type. And here's my process. And as you can see, that hits the breakpoint right at the beginning of my work and my program execution here, giving me the ability to debug into my service registrations, into my worker. I can hit F5 here. And there's a question. I guess if I write debugger launch in the program CS, that would pop. It would. That was part of some of the initial guidance that provided that as well. Though, actually, I take that back. Some of the initial guidance that we had relied on you writing the custom code, because if you're passing the flag to request that the tool pause the process before a debugger is attached, your debugger launch code is not going to run. Remember, when we pass that flag, we are launching the process in a state where your code is not going to run until a debugger is actually attached. So keep that in mind. If you want to use the debugger launch approach, you can just emit the command line argument to debug the .NET isolated process.
And then we already talked about that we're working with the VS team to get this full end-to-end experience working in there. It sounds like Sean wants to know a little bit more about what's required. Is it going to be a VS update? How is it going to come when it's available?
Yeah, and I think you probably have that as much information as I do there. It's going to be the standard Visual Studio update mechanism. So when you're going to be prompted in VS when an update is available. You're going to see that the same prompt letting you know, hey, there is an update. One of the things that will be included with that update is the tooling update for functions as well, and that will bring the new experience supporting the isolated model.
Do you know if we're going to have access to a preview kind of build of it?
I don't at this point. I don't know. I would expect us to have access to something like that with some of the previews. So if you are in the preview channel, perhaps it's something that's going to be popping. We can confirm that, but I would expect that to be the case.
Great.
Let me close this, and I apologize for some of the red. The log statements there, like I do have an invalid connection string set up as in my box that I meant to remove before we started sharing some of this information with you all, but I didn't. Any other questions before I want to do a quick time check too. I know that we are.
Yeah, I think we kind of looked at talked to most of the questions that came in. Do you have anything have you shown anything for middleware yet?
Not yet, but we can do that very, very quickly. So I have a piece of middleware actually registered here. Let me show what that looks like, and I'll come back to the registration. So the middleware, if you're familiar with the middleware concept in different languages, in different frameworks, including ASP.NET Core, It gives you the ability to inject custom code into the execution pipeline, into the dispatch pipeline. It's again something that we've seen requests for a long time. It's something that we're now able to enable here with the AutoProc model. You can see that this is very specific to the types of workloads that you would expect to handle with functions. It's not an HTTP-centric middleware, so it's good to make sure it's very clear that you won't be able to just bring an ASP.NET Core middleware and inject that into the pipeline here and have it work. The set of middleware that works there, it's built and designed to work with HTTP workloads. And with that pipeline, the way the ASP.NET Core specifically is set up. The set of middleware, though it follows the same model, so your skills transfer here and apply. We expose a different context and some additional information, some different set of information that you can use from within the middleware to take action. But you have the ability to do the same kinds of things, like cross-cutting concerns. You can implement as part of your middleware. This shows this particular middleware example is actually part of the samples that we have in the repo right now. If you're curious about any specific scenario, including using specific extensions, I would highly encourage you to go to the repo. There is a samples section in the repo that gives you a lot of examples of how to use that. We are working on enhancing a lot of the samples and expanding what we cover there as well. And if you don't see something you're looking for, feel free to open an issue and request. And we're trying to prioritize that based on demand as well. But this shows you an example of code that you can run before your function is executed. Then I'm executing the remaining pipeline chain here, which will go all the way down to your function execution. And after the middleware chain is executed, on the return, I'm actually inspecting some information that was added by the function. So this is a quick middleware example that gives us the ability to enrich the context that is passed in. And before we dispatch, we continue the execution down to the function. And then on the way back, we inspect some information that was added by the function. We are adding some information to the context to give you the ability to have better control over what gets returned to the host, for instance. So that's a very common example, is for you to inspect some condition based on the result, or to handle an exception that happened as your function was being executed, and then modify the response, modify the result that's going to be sent to the host. We are working both on some APIs that we're exposing to make this process a little simpler, but also a lot of documentation, because this process differs a little bit from some of the other middleware that the folks in .NET specifically may have worked with. You have to remember, we are working with potentially multiple outputs here. So you may have to understand, what am I going to do when I'm bound to a bunch of different output bindings? Like, how do I want to set the results? All of those things are things that we'll be exposing. We'll be working on documentation and guidance to help folks handle some of those scenarios. We can run these and take a look, but in the meantime, if you want to, and this is how I would actually configure my middleware. I apologize for the code formatting here, but I would just working against the function builder. I have the ability to call one of the middleware APIs. I also have the ability to run. Now it's something that we've added. There's an API that will enable you to just define a piece of middleware in line, so you don't have to go define a different type. So you can just provide a delegate that will be injected and executed in the dispatch pipeline here. But if I put a breakpoint on this, make sure I run, and we can address any questions we may have in the meantime. Anthony?
Yeah, there's a question about whether or not we can use this to for authentication and authorization.
You can. You can. You will need to inspect. So that's some of the guidance that I think we need to better document right now, is how you inspect the conditions that you want to look for. in order to understand whether that particular invocation is meets your authorization requirements or not. But it is something that you would have the ability to do. So as we walk through that, we can actually talk about what we could do. Let me execute the function, and we can take a quick look. So right here, where my breakpoint is hitting, my function hasn't executed yet, and the remaining middleware pipeline has not been executed yet. It's important to mention that the same way you would expect this to work, the same way this works in different frameworks, like the order of middleware here, the order you register the middleware matters. So they will be executed in the order they've been registered here. So anything downstream from you will only execute if you make this call. So this is your chance. When you inject a piece of middleware, you have the ability to inspect the context, look at some of the information that is available to you. You have access to things like binding data, which is we have documentation covering that. Is a concept that carries over from the in-proc model. So it's not specific to auto-proc, but it's all of the data that was provided to you by the trigger that initiated the event, the function execution. You have access to all of the different services, the function ID, the definition of the function that's being executed, and a bunch of additional contextual information that is given to you as part of this type. At this point, you have the ability to inspect this information and make a decision. Should I allow this request, this invocation to proceed or not? If you decide not to, you can short circuit the invocation, but by not executing the remaining of the pipeline, setting the result explicitly from your middleware. There are some limitations on what you can do today with some of those APIs, but as part of the guidance and the work that we're doing to essentially enhance this experience when it comes to middleware scenarios, you have the ability to set the response and the output bindings value more specifically to anything that you want to from your middleware.
Okay, great. I think we'll take one more question and then we'll kind of talk about what's next. And it's a pretty general question about any guidance for migrating to the isolated model from the in-process.
We actually, that's a great question. We actually have an issue in the repo right now. Most of the guidance that we've provided so far has been with the starting new experience. We're working on more detailed documentation on that. I would encourage you to go to the repo. I can share a link to the issue here as well. And if you want to just watch that issue, as we make progress on that, we'll continue to update that with comments and links to the official docs, giving you guidance on what settings you will need to change, how you will need to change your deployment, and some of the things that you need to do to an existing app to move to the isolated model.
Okay, great. Yeah, and with that, let's kind of just quickly cover what we're working on next in relation to .NET. So I think you should expect to have pretty regular Worker SDK releases. I think we're kind of getting ready for one pretty soon.
Yeah, we're trying to follow the sprint cadence for releases as well. So we would expect at least at the very beginning now, we're having very frequent API review meetings and trying to expand on what we've built here. And on average, every 2 weeks, we would expect to have a package update, at least at the very beginning here.
Cool. Yeah, and then we talked about full Visual Studio support. I think the Visual Studio release that we're planning to be in is 16.10. Is that correct?
That's what I understand. Yes.
Okay. And there might be some.
It will be aligned with that version. Will be aligned with what the deployment of that version, availability of that version.
Yep, sounds good. And I think we plan on providing some samples for F# and probably making sure that F# works properly.
Right. Right. Yeah, we're working to provide some of those samples and templates as well. Not just samples, but have templates in the tools so that you can get started with F# without having to figure out how to work with this API yourself.
Okay, great. And yeah, and we kind of talked about at the beginning. We are still planning to continue on and produce a new version of the Azure Functions host that will support .NET 6, and we're going to have a preview of that in the next few months that
Right.
that we can all work on. And then the plan is that we'll support .NET 6 LTS when it GAs in November. And then we already talked about durable functions. Anything else to add there for durable or rich types?
Not for durable specifically. For rich types, this is something that we should expect to see incremental enhancements towards the same experience that we have today. For some of the SDKs, that will come sooner than others. Some SDKs do require some additional work in the out-of-proc infrastructure for us to have the ability to light up some of those capabilities in .NET. The nice thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that once we do that work, a lot of the other languages will be able to benefit from that as well. So if you care about the other languages, if you're not just exclusively writing code in .NET, this is something that will benefit you as well.
Okay, great. And I think we pretty much covered all the questions. Do you have anything you want to wrap up with? I can share a link to the repo.
Yeah, a link to the repo would be great. We are watching that. If you'd like to engage, like we would welcome feedback, suggestions. Any requests really help us prioritize what we've been, what we want, what we should be working on. So yeah, I would encourage you to really start the conversation there. Feel free to reach out on Twitter, different channels. Our handles are here as well. Yeah, the more feedback we have on this new model, the better. We really hope this takes a lot of the boxes, and addresses a lot of the long-standing requests that we've had from customers using .NET for a while now. And we do realize that there are quite a few gaps at this point when we compare the two experiences, but this gives us a path forward, and really something that I think will meet a lot of the requirements we have been unable to meet so far, including our ability to be a little more flexible and very quickly adopt new versions of .NET as they come along.
Great. And with that, I think we'll wrap it up. Thanks so much for joining us today. And yeah, please feel free to interact with us in the repo. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks, Fabio.